My sister thought she owned my money. She was wrong. There is a specific kind of silence that happens in a bank lobby when a teller looks at you like you've done something wrong, even though you haven't done anything at all. That silence found me on a Tuesday afternoon in March, the kind of ordinary Tuesday where nothing is supposed to happen, when I stood at the counter of my own bank and was told that my account had a hold on it. Not a small hold. Not a mistake that could be fixed with a phone call. A hold that the teller couldn't explain, that made her eyes drop to her keyboard instead of meeting mine, that made her ask me very quietly if I had recently spoken to anyone about the account. I hadn't. I hadn't spoken to anyone about that account in over a year, because that account wasn't really mine to spend from. It was mine to inherit from. It was the trust my grandmother had set up for me 11 years earlier, the one she'd built slowly out of a life of clipping coupons and never once complaining about the husband who left her with 3 kids and a mortgage, the one she used to tell me about over tea when I was in college, tapping the side of her cup like she was tapping a secret. "This is yours," she used to say. "Not your sister's. Not your mother's. Yours. Because you're the one who sat with me." I want to tell you that this story starts with betrayal, but it doesn't. Starts with grief. My grandmother died 2 years before that Tuesday, in a hospital room that smelled like antiseptic and the lavender lotion she insisted the nurses use on her hands. I was there. My sister Denise was not. Denise was on a business trip in Denver, something about a marketing conference, something she said she absolutely could not move. And I remember holding my grandmother's hand and thinking that this was the last time in my life I would ever feel unconditionally loved by someone who wasn't obligated to love me. After the funeral, things happened the way things happen in families that have learned, over generations, to smile through discomfort. My mother handled the estate. Denise handled logistics, which mostly meant she posted a black and white photo of our grandmother on Instagram with a caption about legacy. I went back to my life in Ohio, back to my job as a physical therapist, back to the small rented house I shared with my husband Marcus and our 6-year-old daughter Junie. I trusted my family. That's the part people don't understand when they hear these stories later. It's not that I was naive. It's that trust in a family is supposed to be the baseline. You don't wake up each morning auditing the people who share your blood. You just live. Which is exactly why, when the teller told me my account was frozen and flagged for third-party dispute, I felt the floor tilt very slightly under my feet. "What third party?" I asked her. She wasn't allowed to say. She could only tell me to speak to the trust department, and the trust department, when I called them from my car in the parking lot with my hands shaking so hard I had to put the phone on speaker, told me something that took a full minute to actually land in my brain. They told me that 6 weeks earlier, someone matching my sister's identification had come into a branch in Columbus with power of attorney documents and had begun making withdrawals. Not small ones. The kind of withdrawals that, over 6 weeks, add up to a number I still have trouble saying out loud. I sat in that car for 20 minutes without turning the key. Junie's booster seat was in the back, still smelling like the strawberry granola bar she'd eaten that morning. I remember staring at the blank brick wall of the bank building and thinking, this has to be a mistake, because Denise doesn't even know I have power of attorney documents. I never signed any power of attorney. I have never in my entire life signed a single piece of paper giving my sister control over anything of mine. That's the hook of this story, and I promise you it only gets stranger from there. I called Denise first because that's what you do, isn't it? You give people the chance to explain themselves before you assume the worst. She picked up on the fourth ring background noise of a coffee shop behind her, some indie song playing low, the clink of a spoon against a ceramic mug. "Hey," she said casual, like nothing in the world was wrong. "What's up?" I asked her as evenly as I could if she knew anything about a hold on my account. There was a pause. Not a long one. Just half a second too long for someone who genuinely had no idea what I was talking about. "Oh," she said. "That's probably just the bank being weird. You know how they are with big transfers." "What transfers, Denise?" Another pause. "I'll call you back. I'm in the middle of something." She did not call me back. Not that day, not the next day, not for 4 days, during which I drove to the actual bank in person, sat across from a trust officer named Patricia who had kind eyes and a stack of paperwork she clearly didn't want to be showing me, and learned that the power of attorney document on file had my signature on it. My signature. Dated 14 months earlier, notarized by someone whose name I did not recognize in a city, Columbus, I hadn't set foot in since a physical therapy conference 3 years before that. I want you to understand what it feels like to look at your own signature and know with total certainty that you did not write it. It's not like seeing a stranger's handwriting. It's like seeing your own face on someone else's body. Familiar and wrong in a way that makes your stomach drop before your brain even finishes processing why. Can I get a copy of this? I asked Patricia, and my voice came out steadier than I felt. She hesitated, glanced at her screen, and then very quietly said something that I think about often. Given the dispute, I think that's something you're entitled to. Let me print it for you. I left that bank with a manila folder pressed against my chest like it might fly away, and I sat in my car for the second time that week, staring at a photocopy of a signature that was and wasn't mine, and I felt something shift in my chest that wasn't quite anger yet. It was closer to disbelief. The kind of disbelief that makes you replay every conversation you've ever had with a person, searching for the moment you should have seen this coming. That night, I didn't tell Marcus everything. I told him there was a problem with the trust account, that I needed to sort out some paperwork. I didn't want to say the word sister and forgery in the same sentence until I understood what I was actually looking at, because some small stubborn part of me still wanted there to be an explanation. Maybe the notary made an error. Maybe there was a different account with a similar number. Maybe. I called my mother next. If anyone would know what was going on, it would be her, since she'd handled the estate. My mother's voice on the phone has a particular texture when she's trying to manage a situation rather than actually address it. Bright, quick, full of little verbal pats on the head. "Oh honey, I'm sure it's nothing," she said. "Denise has been under so much stress with the new house. Maybe she just needed a bridge loan and used the wrong account by accident." "Mom, that's not how bank accounts work. And the signature on the power of attorney isn't mine." The silence that followed was longer this time. Long enough that I actually pulled the phone away from my ear to check the call hadn't dropped. "I'm sure there's an explanation," she finally said. "You know how Denise is. She wouldn't do anything to really hurt you." I remember hanging up and sitting very still in my kitchen, the overhead light buzzing faintly, Junie's crayon drawings taped crookedly to the fridge behind me, and thinking that my mother's response told me almost as much as the forged signature did. She hadn't asked what happened to the money. She hadn't asked if I was okay. She had gone immediately and instinctively into protecting Denise. That's when the mystery of this story really opens up, because once I stopped assuming this was a misunderstanding and started treating it like something I needed to investigate, I began to notice things I'd spent 2 years politely not noticing. The new house Denise and her husband had bought 8 months earlier, a 4-bedroom colonial with a stone facade, that she'd casually mentioned was possible because of some smart investments. The new car in her driveway the last time I visited, a silver SUV she said was leased practically for free through her husband's work. The trip to Portugal she'd posted about in the fall, the one where she captioned every photo with some variation of manifesting abundance. At the time I'd felt the small, ordinary sting that you feel when a sibling's life seems to be expanding while yours stays steady. And I told myself the way you're supposed to, that comparison is the thief of joy, that I had a good life, that money wasn't everything. I hadn't let myself ask the obvious question, which was, where was all of this actually coming from? I decided I needed to talk to someone who wasn't my mother and wasn't Denise. My grandmother's estate lawyer, a woman named Eleanor Voss who had known our family for almost 20 years, who had sat with my grandmother during the drafting of that trust and had, I remember distinctly, told me at the funeral to call her, if anything about the trust ever felt off. I hadn't understood at the time why she'd said that with such particular weight in her voice. I understood it now. Eleanor's office was in a converted Victorian house downtown, the kind of place with creaky floors and a receptionist who offered you tea without asking if you wanted it. When I sat across from Eleanor's desk and told her what had happened, she didn't look surprised in the way I expected. She looked tired, the specific tiredness of someone who has seen a pattern before and hoped this time it wouldn't repeat. "Your grandmother was very particular about that trust," Eleanor said, pulling a thick folder from a locked cabinet behind her. "She named you as sole beneficiary, not because she didn't love Denise. She loved Denise very much. But she told me, and I'm going to say this to you exactly the way she said it to me, that Denise had never once in her whole life sat with her through anything hard. Your grandmother's words. She said you were the one who showed up." I felt my throat tighten hearing that because it was such a specific echo of what my grandmother used to say to me directly, and there was something almost unbearably tender about hearing it repeated back by someone else, someone official, someone who had no reason to make it up. So how did Denise get access? I asked. If I was the sole beneficiary, how did she even get her hands on withdrawal power? Eleanor opened the folder and turned it toward me. Inside was the original trust document, and clipped to the front of it was a second document, an amendment dated 8 months before my grandmother's death, adding Denise as a co-trustee, in the event of the primary beneficiary's incapacity. Your incapacity, Eleanor said carefully, which, as far as I'm aware, has never occurred. I stared at the amendment. There was a signature at the bottom, my grandmother's, shaky but recognizable, the kind of handwriting she developed in her last year when her hands had started trembling from the medication. Below it was a witness signature, and beside the witness line was a name I recognized immediately, because it was the same notary who had allegedly notarized my forged power of attorney. This notary, I said, my finger tapping the name. I need to know who this person is. Eleanor's expression shifted into something more serious. I was wondering when you'd noticed that. This is where the evidence part of the story really begins, the part where what had felt like a strange bureaucratic accident started to reveal itself as something deliberate, something built slowly and carefully over the better part of a year. Eleanor gave me the notary's business address. A small office above a nail salon in a strip mall 20 minutes from Denise's new house. I didn't go alone. Marcus insisted on coming, and by then I had told him everything, sitting at our kitchen table with Junie asleep upstairs, watching his jaw tighten with a kind of controlled fury that made me grateful, not for the first time, that I had married someone steady. The notary, a man named Gary Filman, was not hard to find, and he was, it turned out, not hard to rattle either. When we explained who we were and what we were looking into, his face went through a fast sequence of expressions, confusion, recognition, and then something that looked a great deal like fear. I notarize a lot of documents, he said. I don't remember everyone. You'd remember forging a signature, Marcus said quietly, and I watched Gary Filman's composure crack down the middle. He didn't confess outright. People like that rarely do. But he got visibly nervous, started talking about how he'd just witnessed what was in front of him, how the woman who came in seemed like she had every right to be there, how he wasn't in a position to question family business. He mentioned almost as a slip that she had come in twice, once for the trust amendment, once for the power of attorney, and both times had brought a woman with silver gray hair who he'd assumed reasonably was our grandmother. That detail sat in my chest like a stone. My grandmother had been in hospice 8 months before her death. She had not been leaving the house, let alone traveling 20 minutes to a strip mall to sign legal documents. Whoever that silver-haired woman was, she was not my grandmother, and the fact that Denise had brought someone along to impersonate her told me this hadn't been a single moment of weakness. It had been planned. I spent the next several weeks doing something I never imagined myself capable of, quietly building a case against my own sister. I requested every bank statement connected to the trust going back 2 years. I asked Eleanor to pull the full history of amendments to the trust document. I started keeping a folder of my own, a growing stack of paper that felt, some nights, like the only solid thing in a world that had gone soft and uncertain beneath me. What I found laid out across bank statements and transfer records was a pattern that made my hands cold every time I looked at it. The withdrawals hadn't started 6 weeks before my bank visit. They'd started 10 months earlier, in amounts small enough to avoid triggering automatic alerts. 4,000 here, 6,000 there. Always just under whatever threshold the bank used for manual review. It was only in the last 6 weeks, once Denise apparently believed the account was fully under her control, that the withdrawals had gotten bold, gotten large, gotten careless enough that an automated fraud flag had finally caught the pattern and frozen the account, which ironically was the only reason I'd found out at all. I traced individual transfers to a mortgage company, the down payment on the new house, to an auto leasing company, the practically free SUV, to a travel booking site, Portugal. Every piece of Denise's expanding life for the past year had a corresponding withdrawal from my grandmother's trust, my trust, sitting right there in black and white, dates and amounts lined up like a confession she hadn't meant to write. Somewhere in the middle of that folder building process, I found something I wasn't looking for, something that had nothing to do with bank transfers and everything to do with understanding how long this had actually been in motion. Tucked inside an old greeting card in my grandmother's keepsake box, the one my mother had given me after the funeral because I was the sentimental one, I found a note in my grandmother's handwriting, dated almost 2 years before she died. It wasn't addressed to me. It was a private note to herself, the kind of thing you write when you're working through a decision and need to see your own thoughts on paper. It read, in part, that she had noticed Denise asking pointed questions about the trust at Thanksgiving, questions phrased casually but landing with too much precision to be casual at all. She'd written that she intended to speak with Eleanor about adding additional protections to the account, language that would make it harder for anyone to amend the trust without multiple independent confirmations. She never got the chance. Her health declined faster than anyone expected in her final year, and whatever protective measure she'd been planning simply never made it onto paper before she lost the physical ability to manage her own affairs. Reading that note felt like hearing my grandmother's voice warn me from somewhere just out of reach, a warning that had arrived 2 years too late to stop what happened but exactly in time to confirm what I now understood in my bones. Denise hadn't stumbled into an opportunity. She had been circling it for years, waiting for the moment our grandmother's guard was down enough to slip through. There was one more document that Eleanor found buried in the estate file, and it was the one that turned my disbelief into something colder and more resolved. It was a letter, handwritten, undated, that had been slipped into the folder behind the trust amendment. It wasn't addressed to anyone. It read like a draft, like something written and then abandoned. In my sister's handwriting, which I recognized instantly because it hadn't changed since she used to write me notes in middle school, it said, "Grandma always favored her. It's not fair that I get nothing just because I wasn't the one who sat in that hospital room every day. She would understand if she knew how hard things have been for me." I read that letter 3 times before I fully understood what it meant. Denise hadn't stumbled into this. She had thought about it. She had, in her own mind, built a justification sturdy enough to walk herself through forging a signature, hiring a stranger to impersonate a dying woman, and quietly draining an account for the better part of a year. She hadn't seen it as stealing. She'd seen it as owed. I sat with that letter for a long time in Eleanor's office, and I felt something in me go very still and very clear. I wasn't going to scream at my sister. I wasn't going to show up at her stone-faced colonial house and throw the folder at her feet. What I wanted more than anything was for her to understand that I knew fully and completely, and that I was no longer going to be the sister who found reasons to excuse her. Eleanor and I talked through the options over tea that had gone cold in its cup. I could go straight to the police and file a criminal complaint, which was well within my right, given that forgery and fraud were both factually what had happened. I could go straight to litigation, using the evidence to force full repayment through the courts, which would be faster and, in some ways, cleaner. Or I could do what Eleanor gently suggested, which was to give Denise one chance to face the evidence privately, in a room with witnesses who couldn't be talked around, before anything became public or legal. "You don't owe her that chance," Eleanor said. "But you might want to give it to yourself. Sometimes the most powerful thing isn't the loudest one." I thought about my grandmother then, the way she used to talk about quiet strength, the way she'd say that the people who yelled the loudest in an argument were usually the ones with the weakest position. I decided Eleanor was right. I wasn't going to give Denise a chance because she deserved it. I was going to do it because I wanted to look at myself afterward and know I had handled this the way my grandmother would have respected. I arranged the meeting for a Sunday afternoon at my mother's house, because I wanted my mother in the room too. I wanted her to stop being able to say, "I'm sure there's an explanation." I brought the folder. I brought Eleanor, who came not as a lawyer wielding threats but as a quiet, steady presence who could answer questions if they came up. Marcus stayed home with Junie, not because he didn't want to be there, but because I told him I needed to do this part myself, and he understood the way he always does that some things a person has to carry alone even when they're loved. Denise arrived 20 minutes late, the way she always does, breezing in with a tote bag and sunglasses pushed up into her hair, saying something about traffic before she'd even sat down. My mother had made coffee that nobody drank. The house smelled like the vanilla candle she always burns on Sundays, and for a moment, sitting there in that familiar living room with the same faded couch cushions I'd grown up sinking into, the whole thing felt almost absurdly domestic for what was about to happen. I didn't raise my voice. I want to be clear about that because I think it matters. I opened the folder and I laid the documents out on the coffee table, one at a time the way you deal cards, and I let the silence between each one do the work that shouting never could. The forged power of attorney. Denise's face didn't change. The trust amendment with the mismatched notary date. Flicker there and gone. The bank statements, the mortgage transfer, the SUV lease, the Portugal booking. Each one lined up against the corresponding withdrawal date. Her jaw tightened. And then last the letter. Her own handwriting, staring back up at her from the coffee table. Grandma always favored her. The room went very quiet. My mother had gone pale, staring at the letter like it had physically struck her. Denise's hands, I noticed, had curled slightly in her lap, the way hands do when a person is trying very hard to look composed and isn't managing it. I don't know what that is, she said finally, nodding at the letter, but her voice had lost its usual breezy confidence. It's your handwriting, I said. I'm not asking you to explain it to me right now. I'm telling you that I have it, along with everything else, and that Eleanor has copies, and that this conversation is happening because I wanted to give you the chance to say something true before this goes any further. Any further where? My mother asked, her voice small. That depends on Denise, I said, and I looked at my sister, not with fury, though the fury was there, banked low and steady underneath everything else, but with something closer to grief. I'm not here to destroy your life. I'm here because you tried to erase mine, and I need you to understand that I know exactly what you did, and exactly how long you did it, and exactly what you told yourself to make it feel okay. Denise didn't cry, not at first. She got angry instead, the way people do when they're cornered and haven't yet found the humility to be honest. She said I'd always been the favorite, that I didn't understand what it was like to grow up in my shadow, that Grandma had made her feel invisible for years, that she deserved something too. I let her talk. I didn't interrupt because I understood somewhere underneath my own anger that she needed to get all of that out before she could get to anything real. And then, slowly, the anger cracked, the way it usually does when it's covering something more fragile. She admitted quietly that she'd been struggling financially for over a year before any of this started, that she and her husband had overextended themselves trying to keep up with friends who seemed to have more, that the shame of asking anyone for help had felt unbearable, that once she'd found the trust documents in Grandma's old files and realized how easy the amendment would be to fake, she told herself it was temporary, that she'd pay it back before anyone noticed, and then one lie had required another, and another, until there was no version of the truth left that didn't make her the villain of her own story. My mother sat through all of this with her hands pressed over her mouth, and when Denise finally stopped talking, my mother turned to me and said the thing I had been waiting 2 years to hear, though I hadn't known I was waiting for it. I'm sorry. I should have asked more questions. I should have protected you instead of protecting the peace. I told my mother, and I meant it, that I understood why she'd wanted to believe the best about her own daughter. That's not a crime. But I also told her, and this part one needed her to hear clearly, that protecting the peace at the expense of the truth isn't actually peace. It's just delay. I gave Denise 30 days to begin structured repayment, through Eleanor, with a formal agreement drafted so there would be no ambiguity, no room for the kind of quiet reinterpretation that had gotten us here in the first place. I told her that if she met the terms, I wouldn't pursue criminal charges, not because she didn't deserve consequences, but because I didn't want Junie's aunt to have a record, because some part of me still remembered her holding my daughter as a newborn and crying, actual tears, at how small and perfect she was. I told her that if she didn't meet the terms, I would go to the police, and I would go to court, and I would not hesitate a second time. I want to be honest that this wasn't a clean movie ending kind of forgiveness. Denise sold the SUV within 2 weeks. The house, I heard through my mother, is currently listed, though I don't know the details and I've stopped asking. The Portugal trip is, obviously, not something that can be undone, but she's been paying back what she can in monthly installments that Eleanor tracks with the same careful precision she once used to track my grandmother's trust. The part of this story that surprised me most wasn't the discovery of the fraud, or even the confrontation. It was what happened afterward, in the quiet weeks that followed, when I realized how much lighter I felt simply for having stopped protecting a version of my sister that didn't exist. I had spent years quietly explaining away small unfairnesses, small favoritisms, small moments where Denise got the benefit of the doubt and I got the responsibility. I hadn't realized how much weight that carried until I set it down. My grandmother, I think, would have been sad about all of this the way she was sad about most things involving conflict in her family. But I don't think she would have been surprised. I think in some quiet way she had already known when she wrote that trust the way she did, when she told me directly and repeatedly that it was mine and not Denise's, that she was trying to protect something she could sense was fragile even then. I used to think that was about money. I understand now it was about truth. She wanted there to be a version of this family's history that couldn't be rewritten after she was gone, and when Denise tried to rewrite it anyway, the paper trail my grandmother had insisted on, the careful documentation Eleanor had kept, the trust that had been built with more precision than anyone in the family realized, was the very thing that caught the lie. A few months after the confrontation, Denise reached out and asked if she could see Junie. I said yes on the condition that we meet somewhere public, somewhere with people around, not because I thought Denise would do anything dramatic, but because I needed, for my own sake, to keep some structure between us while trust slowly rebuilt itself or didn't. We met at a small park near my house. Denise brought a stuffed rabbit for Junie, sat on the bench beside me, and didn't try to explain herself or ask for anything. She just watched Junie chase pigeons across the grass, and at one point, without looking at me, she said, "I'm sorry. Not because you caught me. Because of who I was willing to become to get what I wanted." I don't know if that apology was complete. I don't know if any apology after something like this ever can be. But I believed in that moment that it was honest, and honest was more than I'd had from her in over a year. The trust account has been restored. Eleanor helped me set up new protections, safeguards that would make what happened almost impossible to repeat, requirements for multiple independent verifications before any amendment could ever be filed again. My grandmother's money is mine again, sitting quietly where it belongs, waiting for whatever future she imagined for me when she first opened that account 11 years ago and told me, tapping the side of her teacup, that it was mine because I was the one who showed up. I think about that phrase a lot now. The one who showed up. I used to think it just meant being present at the hospital, holding a hand during the hardest hours. I understand it differently now. Showing up, I think, also means being willing to look directly at an uncomfortable truth instead of looking away from it, even when the truth involves someone you love, even when looking away would be so much easier and so much quieter. My mother didn't show up for the truth, not at first. Denise built an entire year of her life on refusing to show up for it. I was the one who finally sat down across from the evidence and looked at it, all of it without flinching, because some inheritance is money, and some inheritance is simply the willingness to face what's real. There's a part of this story I haven't told yet, one that happened in between the confrontation and the quiet, uneasy peace that followed, and I think it matters because it's the part that tested whether any of what I'd decided in that living room was real or just something I'd said in the heat of the moment. About 3 weeks after the meeting at my mother's house, Eleanor called me on a Thursday evening, while I was helping Junie with her spelling homework. Her voice had the particular carefulness she used when she was about to tell me something she knew I wouldn't want to hear. Denise had missed the first scheduled repayment. Not by a small margin either. The agreement called for an initial transfer within 10 business days, and 10 business days had come and gone with nothing. I remember sitting at my kitchen table after that call, staring at Junie's spelling list, the word honest circled in red pen from where she'd misspelled it the first time, and feeling something in me go cold and very still. Part of me wanted to believe there had been a bank error, some innocent explanation, the same reflex my mother always reached for. But I had promised myself, sitting in that living room with the folder open on the coffee table, that I was done being the person who reached for excuses on Denise's behalf. So instead of calling her, I called Eleanor back and asked her to send the formal notice we'd already prepared for exactly this situation, the one that gave Denise a final 5-day window before the agreement would be considered void and I would proceed with the police report. Denise called me herself 2 days later, and for the first time since this whole nightmare began, she didn't sound composed. She sounded frightened, the kind of frightened that comes from finally understanding that consequences are real and not theoretical. She told me she and her husband had gotten into a fight about the house listing, that the sale had fallen through with the first buyer, that she'd panicked and used the money she'd set aside for the first repayment to cover a mortgage payment instead, because otherwise they'd have gone into default before the house even sold. I listened to all of it, and then I told her something I'd been turning over in my mind since that Sunday afternoon. I told her that I understood people make desperate choices when they're drowning, but that desperation didn't undo what she owed me, and it definitely didn't undo what she owed the truth. I told her the 5-day window still stood. Not because I wanted to punish her further, but because every time I bent the terms to accommodate her circumstances, I was teaching her all over again that consequences were negotiable if she just found the right story. She made the payment on day 4. It wasn't the full scheduled amount, but it was a good faith transfer large enough that Eleanor agreed it satisfied the terms of the notice. I won't pretend that call didn't cost me something. I cried afterward, alone in my car in the school pickup line, waiting for Junie, feeling the strange grief of having to be the responsible party in a relationship that should never have required this much accounting between two sisters who used to share a bedroom and swap secrets under the covers with a flashlight. That was the moment, more than the confrontation itself, when I understood that rebuilding anything with Denise was going to be a long project with no guaranteed outcome, and that my responsibility wasn't to make that project easy for her. My responsibility was only to make sure I never again ended up standing in a bank lobby, blindsided by a truth that had been growing in the dark for the better part of a year. I don't know exactly what happens next in my relationship with my sister. Some days feel like the beginning of something rebuilding, slow and careful. Other days I still feel that specific cold disbelief return, the one from the bank parking lot, the one where I have to remind myself that the person who did this is the same person who used to braid my hair before school. Grief and anger, it turns out, can occupy the exact same space in a person's chest for a very long time. But I know this much for certain. I am no longer the sister who explains away unfairness to keep the peace. I am no longer the daughter who lets her mother's discomfort dictate what truths are allowed to be spoken out loud. I sat in that living room with a folder full of evidence and I did not raise my voice, and I did not need to because the truth, laid out plainly and without apology, is louder than any shouting match could ever be. My grandmother used to say that the quietest people in a room are often the ones holding the most power, because they're the ones who don't need to perform their strength to know it's real. I understand that now in a way I didn't before all of this happened. I didn't win this by being loud. I won it by being patient, by being thorough, by trusting that the truth, once fully assembled, doesn't need me to defend it. It only needs me to be brave enough to lay it on the table and let it speak for itself. Denise thought she owned my money because she'd convinced herself, somewhere along the way, that fairness was something she was owed rather than something she had to earn honestly. She was wrong, not because a court or a bank or a lawyer told her so, though they eventually did, but because the truth was always going to surface the way truth tends to, patiently in its own time, waiting in bank statements and handwritten letters and notary logs for someone willing to look. I was that someone. And I would be her again without hesitation because some things are worth protecting quietly, patiently, and completely no matter who you have to protect them from.